There was once a wild brumby, beautiful, powerful and rippling with muscle. She loved to run flat out across the plains, leaping fallen logs and creeks with ease. Though other wild horses lived there too, each ran alone and free. When wranglers would come to capture and break them, they'd scatter in terror, eyes flashing white with fear. The wild young brumby would use her powerful muscles to escape, running blindly into the bush. But one day she was caught, a lasso around the neck. The rope burned. She was terrified. They dragged her into the pen. Blood trickled down her leg where she'd attempted to leap free, tearing a chunk out of her fetlock. Each day, strange men came at her from all angles, whipping and yelling. She couldn't understand what they wanted. Panic raged through her body. And when they left her at night, tired and bruised, all she dreamed of was the freedom of the plains. After many months, her dreams faded. She realised that if she just yielded to the wrangler's tug on the bit, the whipping would stop. With a broken spirit, she began to obey her new masters. She submitted to the bridle. Whatever they desired, she did. She lost the memory of what it felt like to run free and powerful across the plains. Her muscles didn't ripple as they once had. She worked the land with these men, doing their will, her eyes dull and flat. One day, a new man arrived. She didn't care. They were all the same. He exchanged some money with her masters, then led her into the back of a dark truck. Her heart raced with fear. He drove for a long time. When they came to a stop, terror thudded in her ears as she braced herself for the whip. The door opened. The brumby blinked in the strong sunshine. A view she'd long forgotten lay stretched out before her, the edges meeting the horizon. She stood, rooted in shock, gazing at the plains where she'd run as a foal. The man tugged the rope around her neck, leading her from the truck. As her hooves kissed that wild dirt, her muscles began to tremble in anticipation. The man removed her bridle and kissed her between the eyes, then sat down on a deck chair beside the truck. She stood waiting for him to tie her up, but he just winked, placing his broad-brimmed hat over his face and leaning back in the sun as if to have a sleep. The horse began to walk out over the plain. Memories flooded back. She took a big breath of fresh air and began to trot, then broke into a wild dancing gallop, flicking up her back feet in delight. No one would ever trap her again. She was free. She whinnied at the man's foolishness and ran into a thicket of trees, stopping to hide, then peering back at the man. He'd thrown his hat on the ground and was on his feet, clapping and cheering and dancing around wildly, just as she had. The horse did not understand. She moved deeper into the bush to hide. The next morning, she peered out at the man again. He had set up a tent beside the truck and was warming a billy of tea over the fire. He smiled in her direction, then turned and looked down again. The horse quickly trotted back into the bush. Later, she saw him approaching. As she was about to bolt, he stopped, dropping a small bag of apples and carrots. He stepped back, sat down, and lowered his head. She hadn't eaten something so delicious in a long time. It was very tempting. Heart pounding with fear, she raised her head, eyes on the man, and walked slowly toward the pile of food. He hadn't moved. She ate quickly, then trotted back into the bush. For many weeks, the man repeated this. sometimes with carrots, sometimes with corn or hay. One day he held out an apple in his hand. She trembled as she took it from him. The man's hand lightly brushed her fur. She threw up her front legs, whinnying, and ran for the bush. He put the rest of the food in a pile and moved away again. Every day the man was good and kind, and every day she felt safer in his company. After many months, she began letting him stroke her and feed her and walk with her. Often as they walked through the bush together, his hand would rest against her neck. She began to trust him dearly. Once, a snake startled her, but before it could bite, the man's boot crushed its head. Another time, her foot went down a rabbit hole and the bone was broken. He bound up her leg and fed her medicine until it was healed. At night, he slept by the campfire with his head resting against her. One day, he placed his hands gently around her face, as he had done many times before, and leaned his forehead against hers. He seemed to be trying to tell her something. She wasn't sure what it was, but she knew she could trust him. The man kissed her between the eyes, then bent down and pulled something from his bag. The familiar jangle made her eyes grow wide. She jerked back in fear. The man lay a steadying hand on her neck, speaking softly, but the smell of old leather had already hit her nose, and a flood of memories gushed through her heart. She pulled away, huffing noisily. Then her eyes saw it, a bridle. Fear filled her. She remembered how her spirit was once broken, how she was forced to do the will of her masters. She looked at the man in confusion. Why would he want to be her master? They were friends. Why was he bringing out such a dark thing, knowing her history as he did? He was the one who broke her free of that place. Her wild, rippling muscles tensed, but she loved him so dearly. She bowed her head to the bridle, then knelt to the ground, allowing him to climb aboard her back. The metallic taste between her teeth brought back images of grief and pain, freedom stolen, will broken. Tears ran from her eyes as she slowly got to her feet, the man on her back stroking her gently. She felt the joy drain from her body and sadness pool in her soul. She would yield to him as master, for she loved him, but the wound which pierced her heart was a wound of great betrayal. She had thought them to be friends. Instead, he desired to rule her like all the other men. She hung her head and felt her wild heart shrink down small. At least he is a good master, she told herself, as she surrendered to the gentle tug of the bit. She turned obediently and did exactly as he commanded. That night, as they slept beside the campfire, he lay his head against her body as usual, but she felt no comfort, only the sharp twist of betrayal. He turned to look into her eyes, but she kept them shut, a slow trickle of water snaking down her muzzle and dripping into the dust. The man got up, speaking gently, and kissed her between her tightly closed eyes. He pulled out his battered guitar and began to play. He hummed a melody which seemed to wrap around her, then make its way inside her, filling her mind with thoughts of fresh oaten hay and apples plucked from the tree. She opened her eyes and saw him gazing at her, smiling. He laid down his guitar, picked up the bridle, pulled back his arm, and threw it across the plain. Then he sat down, smiling at her, and resumed playing his song. The Brumby lifted her head, looking at the man, then at the bridle far across the plain. She clambered to her feet and trotted to his side, nuzzling his face with her big, wet muzzle. The man let out a belly laugh as he fell back in the dirt. The Brumby lay herself down beside him, and curled up close together, they fell asleep. That night she had a dream. The man was on her back. She felt the safety of his knees gripped firmly around her. The bit rested in her mouth and the bridle around her head. She was in a strange land. She wasn't sure where to go, but the soft tug of her rider calmed her nerves. She knew she could trust him. She was running at a full gallop, feeling his strength flood her. They were doing something important, though she didn't know what it was. She felt his heart entwined with hers, his power and courage and submission. He pulled her to a sudden stop and bent his head to the wind, listening. He seemed to hear the next command, and immediately he squeezed with his knees. She seemed to know exactly what to do, as though they were one creature, as though she and he were born to do this together. She felt elation fill her lungs. This was true freedom, running through the great unknown, completely bonded to her master. The next morning, she awoke early. She let the man's head slide down her body and onto the sand, then trotted to the place where the early morning rays hit a small piece of silver. She picked up the bridle with her mouth, then dropped it beside the man. He sat up, rubbing sleep from his eyes. The wild Brumby stood before him, the bridle at her feet. He smiled. She lowered her head, then knelt on one knee, with her other leg stretched out before him. The man kissed her between the eyes, rubbing her neck, then kissing her all over her head in delight. He strapped the bridle firmly round her face and rested the bit in her mouth. This time, she felt only the good kind of fear, the one that sends tingles down your legs and joy to your heart. For though friendship was good and safe, she was a wild Brumby. She was not built for comfort and endless apples and walks on the plains. She was a powerful creature with rippling muscles and a thirst for adventure. She finally understood. To yield her life to this man was to truly live. Not some half-life of comfort, a full life, bonded and surrendered to her master. She stood to her feet as he wrapped his legs around her girth. Just like the dream, she felt his heart washing through hers. She waited, perfectly still, muscles trembling. Her master squeezed his knees, and she heard him speaking inside her. "To the wilds, my girl." She shook her mane, whinnying with joy, and the adventure of surrender began.